Unselfish acts of faith. Since we claim Christ as our example, we are to be willing to sacrifice our own needs for the good of others. Here now is Gene to explain.
We really see this principle illustrated in a very, very dramatic way in the life of Queen Esther. And the way that's illustrated, she was willing to really pay the ultimate price. And this is amazing to me. This is an incredible example of a willingness to give oneself for the good of others. She was actually willing to pay the ultimate price to save her people from extermination. Now, the story is unfolding here with Haman, who was absolutely filled with rage because Mordecai was not willing to bow down. And notice what happened. If you go to Esther chapter 3, verses 8 and 9, we pick up the story. Then Haman informed King Ahasuerus. Now notice what he said, because you're going to see half-truths all the way through this paragraph. He's going to generalize based on one real significant, what he considers bad experience. And he generalizes it to the whole nation of Israel. And this is what he said to the king. There is one ethnic group scattered throughout the peoples in every province of your kingdom, yet living in isolation. And basically, you remember that the Persian kingdom extended all the way to Africa, all the way over to Syria, going to the west, but going east, all the way to India. This was a huge, huge empire. And what he's basically saying is throughout this empire, there are a whole bunch of these people in these ethnic groups are doing their own thing and they're not obeying you, which was absolutely untrue to the extent that he was saying it. And so he continues, he says, their laws are different from everyone else's and they do not obey the king's laws. And there I think you can see the generalization from the fact that Mordecai refused to bow down to him, which was, in essence, the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If the king approves, let an order be drawn up authorizing their destruction. Now, he's talking about the whole Jewish community or communities throughout the whole Persian Empire. And they were all over the empire. And notice he's got a plan. He said, I'll pay 375 tons of silver to the accountants for deposit in the royal treasury to make sure this murderous act is done. Now, did a little calculation on that and tried to figure it out. And I couldn't figure it out exactly, but you can imagine to today's value, this was an incredible amount of money. It's really sad. And the king was vulnerable, and so consequently he approved it. He gave Haman the signet ring, which gave him the authority to write letters to destroy all of the children of Israel. This is anti-Semitism at its worst. Now, we can understand why Esther was really worried and fearful about this situation, and Mordecai as well, because the letter actually said this. The letter authorized the destruction, to kill, to annihilate all the Jewish people, young and old, women and children, and plunder their possessions on a single day. In other words, it was to be designed, it was to happen, and it was to take place immediately within that situation. At least that day was the beginning of that annihilation. What a tragedy. And so, we read that when Esther heard about it, she was overcome with fear. Well, Mordecai finds out about it, and they are communicating through a messenger. And basically, here is the end of that communication in terms of what Mordecai said to her. Esther chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. Mordecai told the messenger to reply to Esther. Now, keep in mind, she's scared to death. She is really worried. Don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you are in the king's palace. See, the king doesn't yet know that he has just sentenced his queen to death because he's a Jew. And so Mordecai says, if you keep silent at this time, liberation, deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place. He's saying, I know that's true because I know the Old Testament promises to Israel. This will not be the total annihilation, but there's going to be harm, and it's going to come to you and to your whole household. But you and your father's house will be destroyed. Who knows, perhaps you've come to your royal position for such a time as this. And this is really, in a sense, the theme verse of the whole book of Esther. In God's providence. Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And here is where she concluded that, hey, notice these words, Esther 4:16. After that, I will go to the king. Even it is against the law. If I perish, I perish. And keep in mind that she said to Mordecai, look, I haven't seen the king for 30 days. And it is absolutely against the law for anyone to appear in his presence without being invited. And if I suddenly show up, and if he doesn't hold up the gold scepter, I'm gone. He might be in a bad mood that day, and I could lose my life right now. So she knew that she was living dangerously, but she said, if I perish, I perish. She was willing to make that incredible sacrifice. So here we see, yes, she had her back against the wall in a sense, but she really respected Mordecai. She knew that the whole nation of Israel, scattered throughout the empire, was in danger of this horrible Holocaust. And so she was willing to take the brunt of that, as it were, to say, if I perish or perish, I'm going to perish anyway. I'm going to take the risk, and maybe God will deliver us. And so she requested prayer, she fasted, and of course the king then acknowledged her, and we'll see that as we go on in the next principle. And again, we see God's sovereignty in that particular situation. Now, when we move into the New Testament, we see that sacrifice, laying down one's life, was something that happened throughout the New Testament world. James actually was beheaded for the cause of Christ. That's the brother of John. The Apostle Peter, they say, was crucified upside down. Tradition tells us this, and it's probably true, in Rome. The Apostle Paul, tradition tells us, and it's probably very true, that he was beheaded by Nero. In other words, persecution and sacrifice in the New Testament world was not uncommon. And somehow it's easy for us, so removed from that, to not really identify with it. And today, as I was thinking about the world today there are Christians in various parts of the world who are literally giving their lives because of their commitment to Jesus Christ. I have a good friend in another part of the world. I have a lot of good friends in other parts of the world, but this man I know very, very well. Converted out of paganism, converted out of witchcraft, converted out of some horrible situations, became a Christian, went on for theological education here in the United States, went back to his country. And he basically, with his very significant responsibility of overseeing pastors in that particular country, his life is in danger every day. That he could be killed, his whole family could be killed. And yet, he is willing to pay that price. And I read that email and I say to myself, I don't know anything about that. And to be honest with you, I hope we'll never have to experience anything like that. But the fact is that there are people that are willing to lay down their lives for Christ. And they're doing it every day. So the principle that comes to us, let me just review that. Since we claim Christ as our example, we're to be willing to sacrifice our own needs for the good of others. And of course, Christ is our example. He gave everything for us. And if we're going to love as He loved, then that's part of the equation. Now, thankfully, we live in a country where we've been free from that kind of persecution. And I believe it's God's will that we be free from that kind of persecution because we're to pray for peace so that we can proclaim the gospel of Jesus. But there are people all around us throughout the world that are paying that price in a way. But it just comes down to a very simple thing, doesn't it? As far as I'm concerned, as I relate it to my own life. And this question, reflection response question: when was the last time you made an unselfish, sacrificial decision in order to help fellow believers who could not help themselves? And I include myself in that question. Though it's a you question, I ask myself, when is the last time I have really made an unselfish, sacrificial decision in order to help fellow believers who could not help themselves? Well, I think I could point to some things, but in no way does it compare with the ultimate sacrifice that people have paid. Which brings me back to the fact that I ought to be making sacrificial decisions for people, even in my own culture, for my family, for my wife, for my children, for my grandchildren, for my fellow believers, willing in my own way, with the opportunities that God gives me, to give myself to the Lord. Now, it all begins, first of all, with a living sacrifice, doesn't it? Romans 12, where the Apostle Paul says that we are to present our bodies a living sacrifice. A living sacrifice. That is, being willing to live for Christ. He's not saying, I'm asking you to die for Christ, although that certainly could be the implication. What he's saying is, I'm just asking you to live because Christ died and he gave everything. And with that living sacrifice that we give to the Lord, we then can be sacrificial in relationship to our relationship with other people. So to me, that's a very powerful and convicting principle that all of us need to think about, even though we're so far removed from the kind of sacrifice that Esther said she was willing to make. Though I perish, I will perish. It comes down to perhaps just some of the simple things of life, where sometimes we're not even willing to make that kind of sacrifice. So, may God help us to apply this principle. Let me just read it one more time so we fixate it in our minds. Since we claim Christ as our example, we're to be willing to sacrifice our own needs for the good of others.